Hey everybody, Some Gadget Guy here, and I've spent a little time playing around with the LG G Stylo. Now, this camera review took a bit longer than usual as I spent 2 whole days shooting in HD, only to find that meant the camera was shooting in 720p. FHD is 1080p. We'll start this camera review off with some helpful critique. Maybe in the future LG just use numbers so that there will be less confusion. But let's jump into some brightly lit outdoor shots. Camera performance here feels very similar to the G3 Vigor reviewed last year, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Stylo camera wasn't lifted directly out of the Vigor's parts bin. Like last year's phone, we see consistent overexposure with highlights clipping in bright light, and there's no exposure compensation or control to rein that back in. This white flower in morning light, for example, is almost completely washed out with most petal detail gone. These little blue flowers fared a bit better as the camera struggles to hold on to detail. This is another example of the metering trying to expose for the whole scene and ignoring what the user focused on. Spot metering would be greatly appreciated here as well. A perfect example would be these pine cones. I focused on the pine cones in the sun, so it would have been fine if the surrounding tree had been further underexposed. Instead, as there's a ton of info in the shadows, the camera is trying to pull that information out at the expense of what I focused on. Yellows land a bit better than I thought they would. Yellows and reds can be difficult for digital sensors to not clip, and thanks to a little shadow info from the petals, we arrive at nice contrast. Reds in sunlight, however, will deliver a somewhat aggressive and ugly sizzle. In trying to provide a bright, saturated scene, we start to see some rather odd color distortion. Looking at a wider shot, we have fairly decently detailed 1080p video for how lean LG's codec is, usually hovering around an 18 megabit per second bitrate in testing, though I do think they might be applying a bit too much sharpening to try and keep things crisp. I can still praise the focusing system on LG phones though. The Stylo is certainly not the fastest, but it's a smooth and sure-footed slide which rolls into a focus lock. That's a really nice feel on a phone camera in this budget price range. While the focus slides nicely, macro shots can still be a bit tricky as the camera app will report a focus lock even when the camera is too close to the subject. I had a green square telling me this was in focus when it obviously was not. When we do land macro focus, we get a pleasantly detailed view, but the camera lens and sensor don't provide us the nicest bokeh. The background blur is a bit busy for my taste, and I believe this is exacerbated by the software sharpening mentioned earlier. There doesn't seem to be any kind of pixel resampling happening while zooming, and like last year's Vigor, this is kind of a mess of digital artifacts at full zoom. LG supplies us with a great laser focusing system, but I wish they would start including image stabilization on their budget phones. No hardware or software stabilization positions this walking test towards the bottom of the list of phones we've reviewed. All of the shots in this review suffer from my hands being a bit shaky. For a bright day in LA and a tendency to overexpose, the Stylo manages acceptable performance in our street scene. It's not the best dynamic range we've ever seen, but only white cars are clipping bad. I could do with just a bit more contrast, help pull a little more blue out of the sky, make those greens a little richer, but I was honestly surprised to see how well this shot came out. Our freeway test shows similar performance in color and exposure, and it's an extreme example of the classic LG issue with audio. The noise reduction is so aggressive on any shots with background audio that you're often left with a digitally distorty, warbly sound. That's not very pleasant. A quick chat about still photos. When shooting widescreen 16:9, the Stylo can deliver some pretty decent 6 megapixel stills. We still have the same issues with exposure, metering, and oversaturation, but with a little care, these shots look good. I'm not personally a fan of HDR. I would greatly prefer exposure controls, and the Stylo reinforces that bias. In good light, HDR on the Stylo seems to just be a shadow brightening mode, which the camera didn't have any issues overexposing before. In shaded conditions, it clips even worse. I already think a lot of tech bloggers use HDR as a crutch in their smartphone camera reviews, and I just couldn't find a situation where HDR made any shots better here on this LG. We also get a panorama mode, but this is not using the stitching software found on more expensive LGs. If your scene is relatively simple, you'll end up with a nice wide shot and plenty of resolution to work with. But if there's a mix of foreground and background elements, then you'll see a lot of tearing, it seems. Now into some nighttime shots, and the Stylo showcases yet another issue in reducing the frame rate from 30 to 24 frames per second. Worst, in this scene, the phone is still trying to expose brighter than it needs to, and even with the slower frame rate, this camera camera is cranking the ISO. We end up with a blurry, noisy, grainy image, even with the street lamps providing a little extra illumination. The exposure is actually a bit more even-handed on our creepy tunnel shot, but noise issues remain. I was very happy to see the Stylo nail the white balance on our creepy gate, however. This is very close to what the lighting looks like in real life, as this is lit with a pretty gross orange-yellow security lamp. And happily on our walkway, we again see accurate color from these two bulbs, which aren't quite the same color temperature. So where's that leave us with the camera on the LG G Stylo? This phone is positioned as a budget productivity champ, and likely to reach a decent price point. LG opted for a camera which could cover the basics and not much more. To be frank, this sensor was a mid-pack performer last year on the Vigor, and this year we've seen some fantastic improvements to other phones in this price range like the Lumia 640 and the Alcatel Idol 3. The Stylo camera certainly isn't a bad camera, but we would hope LG would start putting newer hardware into their lower cost phones. I'll of course leave some links down below this video where you can find more info on the LG G Stylo and shop this puppy online. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more reviews like these, and I would not be able to continue producing on this channel without your support. Hitting the fan funding, using my Amazon affiliate links, and sharing my videos on your favorite social networks like Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, and the Googles+, so please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.